there, wine lovers. Colleen from Through the Wine Glass with you again today. I don't know about the rest of you ladies, but after 5 weeks in lockdown without a hairdresser in sight, starting to feel a little bit ragged. Don't know about you, but that's the way I'm feeling. Oh, for a hairdresser. Anyway, that's not the topic of conversation today. Today we're going to talk about the very contentious issue and debate, cork versus screw cap. Very, very contentious, has been for a long time. Lots of different debates and views on the issue. A lot of sort of new world, old world views that differ dramatically on the use of a screw cap or a cork to see on your wine bottle. So I thought what we'd do is we'd go a little bit, backtrack a little bit and get to the reason why we actually have the options of a cork or a screw cap. So if you look at the cork industry, so cork is basically the bark of a tree. It's a type of oak tree, and it is the bark. So the way that things work with the bark of that tree is it's cut off in sections and then processed to use as corks for wine bottles and various other uses as well. But if we go right back to the beginning of the industry, around about the 1600s sometime, when they started using cork to seal bottles, wine bottles especially, as well as others, the industry grew around the Mediterranean. So you find that a third of the world's cork plantations are in Portugal, others in Spain, Iberia, but basically around the Mediterranean. And if you look at a cork tree, as I said, it is a type of oak. If you look at a cork tree, it takes about 25 years before the first cork can be harvested. So in other words, that piece of bark removed, and then you can only reharvest every 9 years. But the first time that you can actually use the cork as a cork for wine bottles, either as a pure cork or a composite cork, is after the third harvest. So basically you're looking at 25 years plus 9 plus 9. So in the region of about 45 years before the cork, the quality of the bark is good enough for it to be used as a cork for a wine bottle. So there, obviously there you have already see that there's a problem. The demand for cork, and obviously with the growth of the wine industry globally over the last, especially 50 years, has increased dramatically. A lot of new world wine countries making a lot more wine than they were 50 years ago. So the demand for cork has increased dramatically. So there already you can see that there's a problem between supply and demand. So demand is much bigger than the supply. And it was right about in the 1950s, 1960s, they started looking for an alternative to cork. And this is where the screw cap came from. And really, Australia and New Zealand really brought the screw cap, made it famous in the 1990s, where they started to use screw caps for most of their wines. So there we've got this sort of new world, old world thing going on. And a lot of the debate around screw cap versus cork has to do with perceptions. So the perception of taking a cork out of a good bottle of wine and hearing that as it comes out is what one sort of expects with a good quality bottle of wine. And that really does guide a lot of people's opinions. So people say, well, if I'm spending a bit of money on this bottle of wine, I expect it to have a cork. Then you have to have a look at what the purpose of the cork or the screw cap is. What do they do for that wine? So the cork is slightly porous. So what you will find is that there will be a minuscule amount of oxygen that will be able to go through the cork into the wine, which helps with long-term maturation, but very small amounts. You don't want the wine to become oxidized. So that small, minuscule amount of air that goes in is not bad for the wine. Then you have, sometimes you do have a problem with what we call cork taint. So that is a bacteria that gets into the cork, and then that basically makes your wine go off. So a lot of problems were experienced with sort of 1 in every 12 or 13, 14 bottles of wine suffering from this TCA, this cork taint, and in other words, having to be thrown away. Whereas with your screw cap is made from aluminium, and that will seal your bottle and not really allow any movement of air in and out of the bottle. So generally the idea has been traditionally that your full-bodied wines, your wines that you want to age for a while, they would be better with a cork, and then your easier drinking styles of wine, younger wines, would be better with a screw cap. So that's really where your debate comes in. And when people say, I've had this question asked of me quite often on wine tours with my international guests, which one is better? And there's no real better. One isn't better. They serve different purposes. And the perception of screw cap being cheap and only for cheap wine has really changed dramatically over the last couple of years, where you're having a better quality wine that is using a screw cap to seal it. And then a lot of the really, really expensive full-bodied, especially red wines, still going the route of having a cork. Another issue, obviously, to consider is the cost. So generally, you will look at a cork being about 3 times the price of a screw cap. So that will also guide you when you're looking at your different styles of wine. So your more full-bodied, your more expensive wines, it's justified to use a cork. Your sort of easier drinking styles of wine, probably better with a screw cap. So as I said, there's no right or wrong in this whole scenario. Just going back to the issue of the cork, as I said, because there wasn't enough of the cork for the demand, wasn't enough supply, there were various options, different options in the cork as well. So we look at the pure cork, which is punched out of the bark in a solid piece. That is your pure cork. Then you're looking at something that we call composite cork, which is basically little granules that are under high pressure pressed together in the shape of a cork. And that's basically bound with glue. So these are all treated so they won't have any adverse effect on your wine. With your cork as well, when you are aging your wine with a cork in, ideally your wine will have to be matured on its side. So you have your cork in there, your wine must be in contact with the end of the cork to keep it moist, and that will prevent the cork from drying out. So if you are having your bottle standing up, you might have a situation where your cork dries out, it starts crumbling, and then oxygen will obviously be able to get into the wine. With your screw cap, you can store your wine bottle standing up because you don't have the same issue as you would have with your cork. So you're just looking at a couple of ideas with the screw cap versus the cork. And a lot of debate goes on around this whole issue as to whether people are happy to pay a little bit more money if a bottle has got a screw cap on it. Obviously, for convenience sake, you don't have to, if you're going on a picnic, you don't have to have a corkscrew with you. You can just take your screw cap off, which makes it more convenient. But people's perceptions are changing. People are getting more used to a style of wine that has a screw cap without really looking at it as if it's a cheap wine. And I think that's a lot governed by the styles of wine that we're making. A lot of the New World wines are very innovative, lots of different technology being used, embracing new ideas, which is very important. So when I talk about New World and Old World, basically we're talking about everything inside Europe, New World, everything outside Europe. When we look at New World wine countries, we look, for example, at countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, Chile, North America, those kind of countries we typically refer to as New World. So there we're looking at a lot of new innovations of new technology. At one stage, there was what we were referred to as a plastic cork. So it looked like the same sort of shape as a normal cork, but made out of plastic. But the problem with that is with your aperture on your wine bottle, the aperture is not exactly the same to the fraction of a millimeter on every single bottle of wine. So your cork can actually, with obviously being in touch with the wine, can actually swell to fit that aperture perfectly, so you don't get that too much of the air going in, whereas the plastic corks couldn't do that. So basically what we found is a lot of wine that was oxidized because too much oxygen had gone in through the actual cork, the plastic cork, into the wine, and resulting in that horrible sort of musty, damp sort of smell, and obviously the taste very unpleasant when your wine is being corked or oxidized. So we don't use the plastic corks in South Africa really anymore. So we basically mostly focus on screw caps and then obviously on cork. As I said, the cork is quite a bit more expensive, at least 3 times more than a screw cap. So that is definitely something to factor in when you're looking at the costing of a bottle of wine, is what the cork versus the screw cap will cost you. So basically, that's just an idea of the debate. As I said, a very contentious debate. And I reiterate that there's no right or wrong. It's really about people's perceptions changing to be able to be more accommodating to the idea of a screw cap, as opposed to being really stuck on the fact that it's got to have a cork. A good bottle of wine has got to have a cork. So people's perceptions are changing. And that really is changing the landscape of how we bottle our wine, the closures that we use. There are other various closures that can be used as well. Typical French glass stopper or glass cork is very rarely used in South Africa, but there are a couple of farms that use it. So that's basically just a little bit of information on this contentious debate about cork versus screw cap. No right, no wrong. Both has their own place in the winemaking process. And as people get more used to the idea of not having all of their wine with a cork in it, people's perceptions start to change slightly. And that's really what we were talking about today. So thank you very much for joining me. I'd love you to post some comments and give me some ideas of other subjects that you might like me to discuss, and give me a little bit of feedback on my videos. As I said, I am the host of a program called Through the Wine Glass, and I'd just love you to join me on this journey of wine that is my passion. And I say thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you.